picture this. Okay, it's 1992. The LA riots are happening. We've got the first Clinton-Bush election going on. And right smack in the middle of it all, you've got this kind of crazy cultural clash. And it all comes down to, of all things, a fictional TV news anchor.
Oh, yeah. You're talking about the whole Dan Quayle versus Murphy Brown thing, right? It's wild how a sitcom character ended up as, like, a political target.
It's bizarre, right? Like, looking back now, it seems like just a weird pop culture blip. But, when you really dig into it, this whole episode, it actually tells us a lot about American politics and the media, especially back in the early 90s. And we've got this episode of the You're Wrong About podcast, and it really gets into the nitty-gritty of all this. And honestly, it's packed with insights.
What's so interesting to me is how this thing that seemed, kind of trivial at the time actually exposed all these deep anxieties that were bubbling under the surface of society. And it actually ended up being a real turning point in how politicians use these cultural issues to their advantage.
Right. Okay, so let's rewind back to 92. We've got Bush and Quayle, and they're fighting for re-election, but they're actually trailing behind. And not Clinton, but Ross Perot.
And don't forget about the LA riots. They were happening right around the same time. The whole nation was struggling with these massive issues, race, poverty, violence, all coming to a head after the Rodney King verdict. And Bush's response was widely criticized, which made the administration look really out of touch.
Yeah, and that's where Dan Quayle enters the picture. He was already seen as, well, a bit of a lightweight, shall we say. So he's trying to shift the entire campaign's focus to this idea of family values.
Right, and he delivers this big, long speech at the Commonwealth Club of California, and it was supposed to be about the LA riots, right?
Right.
But instead of really digging into the complex issues behind the riots, things like systemic racism and urban unrest, he uses the speech to push this very specific narrative.
And what was that narrative exactly?
It was all about what he called the decline of the American family and this concept of the culture of poverty.
Culture of poverty. What does that even mean in this context? It kind of sounds like he's blaming people for being poor.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And in Quayle's speech, culture of poverty basically implied this set of behaviors and values that he thought was keeping people stuck in poverty, like this idea of dependency on welfare. He actually said, and I quote, "It doesn't help matters when primetime TV has Murphy Brown, a character who supposedly epitomizes today's intelligent, highly paid professional woman, mocking the importance of fathers by bearing a child alone and calling it just another lifestyle choice."
Wow, he really went there. But wait a minute, wasn't Murphy Brown's situation more complicated than that?
Exactly. The show made it clear that the father was the one who walked away from his responsibilities. Quayle completely ignores that part of it and just paints this picture of a woman choosing to be a single mother.
So it seems like he was really trying to oversimplify a really complex issue and just shoehorn it into this family values narrative.
Totally. He basically sets up this black and white view of the world, good people versus bad people. And he starts pushing for these policies like the weed and seed programs, which were all about removing people who were deemed undesirable from communities. It was such a simplistic solution that didn't even try to address the systemic factors contributing to poverty and crime.
So he gives this whole long speech about poverty, crime, the decline of the American family, and then boom, drops this Murphy Brown bomb right at the end.
It almost feels like the entire speech was just building up to that one line about Murphy Brown. And of course, the media, they just ate it up. It was crazy, right? I mean, the media just went nuts. All the headlines were all about Quayle's attack on Murphy Brown. Like, the rest of his speech just vanished.
I mean, it's not exactly an everyday thing.
Yeah.
To have a sitting vice president going after a fictional character, that's pure gold for the media.
Oh, totally. It was like a gift. But it also kind of shows how easily these really complex issues can get boiled down to sound bites, and how quickly the public can get distracted from what's actually important. Did all this media attention help Quayle, though?
Oh, not at all. His approval ratings totally tanked. Even President Bush had to distance himself. He came out and publicly praised Murphy Brown, called it an excellent program. It was a huge political blunder.
Yeah, it really backfired. But here's where it gets interesting. Despite all the backlash, Quayle didn't back down. He doubled down on that family values messaging. He realized it really struck a chord with a certain segment of the voters.
Interesting. So which segment was that? Why do you think that message resonated so well with them?
He was appealing to the Christian right. This group was becoming more and more influential in the Republican Party, and they saw Quayle's stance on family values as this defense of traditional morality. It was like he was pushing back against what they saw as the liberal secular agenda.
So this whole thing with Murphy Brown, it started as this kind of out-of-touch moment, but it ended up being a turning point in American politics.
Exactly. Quayle may have stumbled onto it by accident, but he basically created a formula that would change how campaigns are run. From that point on, politicians realized they could really energize their base by focusing on these hot-button social issues, like abortion or same-sex marriage. It was a way to get people fired up and distract from these more complicated debates about the economy or policy.
Wow. It's like he wrote the playbook for the culture wars that are still dominating American politics today.
That's a really insightful observation. The You're Wrong About episode actually points out that the whole Murphy-Brown controversy sparked this huge national debate about single motherhood. But in a lot of ways, the debate completely missed the point.
How so? What was missing from the conversation?
Well, they spent all this time talking about the so-called moral failings of single mothers, but they completely ignored the very real economic struggles that these women were facing. So many of them were just trying to make ends meet in a system that offered practically no support.
So instead of blaming them for their circumstances, shouldn't the focus have been on trying to understand why so many women were raising children alone and what could be done to actually provide them with some support?
Absolutely. The conversation should have been about creating a society that actually supports families no matter what their structure looks like. Things like access to affordable childcare, better job opportunities, paid parental leave. Those are the issues that really impact families.
It's interesting how a lot of those same issues are still being debated today. The fight for paid family leave and affordable childcare. It's just as relevant now as it was almost 3 decades ago.
Exactly. And the fact that we're still struggling with these same challenges shows how deeply ingrained these narratives about family and responsibility are in our society.
You know, the podcast also mentioned something that I found really surprising. Apparently, television in the 90s actually overrepresented single-parent households. I always thought 90s TV was all about these wholesome two-parent families.
Right. That was the image they were projecting. But the reality was very different. There were tons of shows featuring single dads, Full House, My Two Dads, even Punky Brewster. But there were way fewer shows with single moms.
So this whole argument that TV was glamorizing single motherhood doesn't really hold up, especially since there were actually more single dads on TV.
Yeah.
Maybe the real issue wasn't the number of single parents being depicted, but how those families were portrayed.
You're getting on something really important. A lot of those shows presented this very sanitized and unrealistic view of single parenthood, you know? Everybody's happy and well-adjusted, and that might have contributed to this idea that any family structure that wasn't the perfect nuclear family was somehow doomed to fail.
Which, of course, is just not true.
Yeah.
Families face challenges and go through ups and downs regardless of their structure.
Exactly. By presenting this idealized version of family life, TV might have unintentionally reinforced the idea that single-parent families were somehow inherently problematic. But the research mentioned in the podcast actually shows that the negative outcomes they were talking about had more to do with economics than with family structure.
So what do you mean by that?
Well, they found that children of wealthy single mothers, they didn't experience the same disadvantages as kids from less affluent backgrounds. They had access to resources and support systems that helped them overcome the challenges that are often associated with being raised by a single parent.
So it wasn't the single motherhood itself. It was the lack of resources that often came with it.
Precisely. When you really boil it down, the Murphy-Brown controversy wasn't actually about a sitcom character at all. It was about these anxieties around changing social norms and economic inequality and the role of government in supporting families.
So it's more about using a cultural flashpoint to push a political agenda.
Exactly. And it's a tactic that we've seen play out over and over again in American politics ever since.
You know, it's amazing how this whole Murphy-Brown thing started as this kind of off-the-cuff remark and blew up into this huge cultural phenomenon. And then it went on to shape political strategy for years to come.
Yeah, it's really a testament to the power of symbolism and
Yeah.
how politicians can tap into these anxieties that people have about their lives and their values to push their own agendas.
And we see that happening all the time now, don't we? Pick any hot-button issue, immigration, gun control, LGBTQ plus rights, and it instantly becomes this rallying cry that drowns out any kind of nuanced discussion about policy.
It's a tactic that works really well for getting voters riled up, but it often comes at the expense of having real conversations about solutions and finding some common ground.
So in a way, Dan Quayle, even though he was ridiculed for that Murphy-Brown comment, he actually ended up laying the groundwork for the kind of divisive political rhetoric that we're bombarded with today.
It's a pretty sobering thought, isn't it? He might have been a bit of a laughingstock at the time, but he stumbled onto this formula for political engagement that's been copied and refined over and over again.
It makes you wonder how differently things might have played out if the focus had stayed on the real issues that Quayle was supposed to be talking about in that speech. things like poverty and inequality and the challenges of urban life.
Imagine if all that energy had gone into finding solutions to those problems, instead of getting sidetracked by this debate about a fictional TV character.
It's a good reminder that as citizens, we have a responsibility to be aware of how these tactics are being used to manipulate us and to demand more from our leaders.
We need to push for conversations that go deeper than just slogans and sound bites, that acknowledge how complex these challenges really are, and that explore solutions that actually benefit everyone, not just a select few.
This deep dive has been really eye-opening. It's incredible how a moment that seems so insignificant at the time can actually reveal so much about the underlying forces that shape American politics and society.
And it shows how important it is to think critically, to question the narratives that we're being fed, and to engage with the world in a way that's thoughtful and informed.
So maybe the next time we find ourselves getting pulled into a debate about some cultural issue, we should take a step back and ask ourselves, what's the real story here? And who's benefiting from this framing?
That's a great point. Understanding the forces that are shaping our world is the first step towards building a society that's more just and equitable for everyone.
This has been a fascinating look at a moment in history that still has a lot to teach us. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey.
The pleasure was all mine. Until next time.